Welcome to Libyth. To understand why a text like the Kogo Shūi could exist at all, you have to understand how strange and how specific the relationship between religion and power was in the Japan that produced it. This was not a society where political authority and sacred authority sat in separate boxes, one handling the affairs of state and the other handling the affairs of the spirit. They were the same system, fused at the root. The emperor's legitimacy was not a legal abstraction backed by armies and bureaucracy alone. It was understood to flow directly from descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, and the rituals performed at court were not decorative ceremonies layered on top of governance. They were the mechanism through which that divine legitimacy was renewed, maintained, and made visible. This means that whoever controlled the performance of those rituals controlled something that mattered just as much as land or military command, access to the machinery that produced legitimacy itself. Once you see the court ritual system this way, the entire conflict behind the Kogo Shūi stops looking like a dispute over ceremonial protocol and starts looking like exactly what it was: a struggle over one of the central levers of political power in the entire state. That ritual machinery had a name and a structure. It operated, at least in formal terms, through what was called the Department of Divinity, the Jingi-kan, the bureau responsible for overseeing the religious affairs of the court and the network of shrines connected to imperial authority. On paper, this looks like an orderly administrative system, a department, a hierarchy, defined roles. But the actual texture of how that department functioned depended heavily on which hereditary clans had historically been granted which functions within it. And this is where the formal structure and the lived reality start to pull apart from each other. The Inbe clan held, by long tradition, responsibility over the sacred regalia and ritual implements. The mirror, the jewels, the physical objects through which divine presence was invoked and made tangible in ceremony. The Nakatomi clan held responsibility over the liturgies, the spoken prayers and invocations that activated those rituals. In theory, this is a clean division of labor between two equally essential functions. Neither the object nor the word accomplishes anything alone. Ritual requires both. In theory, this should have produced something durable, a stable partnership between two codependent specialists. But administrative theory and political reality are rarely the same animal, and the gap between them is precisely where instability breeds. The formal division of ritual labor said nothing about which family held more land, more court rank, more marriages into the imperial line, more access to whichever faction currently dominated the regency. And on every one of those informal measures, the Nakatomi held an advantage the Inbe simply could not match, because the Nakatomi were not operating alone. They were the parent stock of the Fujiwara clan, and the Fujiwara, by the early Heian period, had begun executing one of the most effective long-term power strategies in pre-modern Japanese history, marrying their daughters to reigning emperors, producing the next heir, and then governing as regent for that heir once he took the throne, often as a child. This is a mechanism that converts kinship into political control with ruthless efficiency. And as the Fujiwara consolidated their grip on the regency, the prestige and influence of every clan connected to them rose by association. The Nakatomi did not need to outperform the Inbe in any ritual sense. They simply needed to be attached to the winning lineage in the broader struggle for control of the throne, and the ritual privileges followed the political tide rather than any formal allocation of duties. This is the mechanism worth dwelling on, because it explains why the conflict behind the Kogo Shūi could not be resolved by simply pointing to precedent or law. The formal structure, equal ritual partners, distinct hereditary functions, remained nominally intact. What changed was everything informal sitting on top of that structure. Which shrines received the most generous imperial offerings, which families' rights were treated as more central to court ceremony, which clans' elders were consulted first when ritual questions arose. None of this required an official decree, reducing the Inbe's status. It only required generation after generation of small, almost invisible decisions, each one slightly favoring the clan with the stronger political backers, until what had once been a balance had quietly become a hierarchy. By the time Hironari sat down to write, there was no single moment he could point to and say, "Here, this is where the injustice happened." There was only an accumulated drift, and that is an extraordinarily difficult thing to argue against using ordinary political means. You cannot petition against a slow drift the way you can petition against a single decree. What you can do, if you are clever and have access to a respected mythological tradition, is try to anchor the present back to an older and more favorable baseline by appealing to a layer of authority that predates and outranks the current political arrangement entirely, the divine order itself. Underneath this ritual political conflict sat a rank system that gave the whole struggle its currency. Court status in Heian Japan was not an informal social impression. It was a precise, graded system of official ranks, and a person's rank determined real and measurable things: what duties they could perform, what income and land they could draw, how close they could stand, literally and figuratively, to the center of imperial power. It is telling, and worth lingering on, that even the historical record of the Kogo Shūi's own composition gets tangled up in this rank system. Different accounts of Hironari's biography disagree about whether, at the moment he submitted the text, he held the rank of sub-junior 5th or the slightly lower higher senior 6th. This might look like a trivial discrepancy, a footnote for specialists, but it is actually a perfect miniature of the entire conflict the text emerges from. Even the precise gradation of one man's court rank was a contested fact, subject to revision and dispute, because rank was never a neutral biographical detail in this system. It was a live political claim every single time it was stated, and the people writing about it later had their own reasons to remember it one way or another. A society organized this tightly around graded status produces exactly this kind of friction, wherever two parties have competing interests in how a particular boundary gets drawn. It's worth zooming further into the family structure operating beneath the clan level, because the Kogo Shūi's entire argument depends on a particular relationship between individual identity and collective house identity that would have felt entirely natural to its original audience, but is worth making explicit for a modern viewer. An individual member of the Inbe clan in this period did not primarily understand himself as an independent actor pursuing his own career within the court. He understood himself, first and foremost, as an instance of his clan, a current bearer of a hereditary role and a hereditary dignity that long predated his own birth and would, in principle, long outlast his own death. This matters enormously for reading Hironari's project correctly, because it explains why a document responding to what looks, on the surface, like one man's frustrated career could plausibly be received as a serious matter of state rather than a personal grievance. Hironari was not petitioning on his own behalf in any narrow sense. He was petitioning as the current voice of an entire hereditary house, And the dignity at stake was not his individual reputation, but the standing of a lineage stretching back, by his own account, to the very beginning of divine history. This is the family structure that makes the whole text legible as something other than personal complaint. The individual petitioner disappears almost entirely into the collective house he represents. And that disappearance is not a limitation of the text, but the entire source of its claimed authority to speak on matters of such cosmic weight. This logic extends outward, in turn, into the broader community structure surrounding the court, because the relationship between centralized ritual authority and the dispersed network of local shrines reproduces, at a wider scale, the same tension between formal unity and actual fragmentation we've already traced at the level of the two rival clans. The imperial court's religious authority depended on being understood as continuous with, and ultimately sovereign over, the much older and more varied landscape of local kami worship that existed in every region of the country, often with histories and practices that long predated any meaningful centralized state at all. Maintaining that fiction of continuity required constant, active management, a steady traffic of recognition, offerings, and ritual incorporation flowing outward from the center to keep local shrines oriented toward the imperial cult, rather than drifting into purely regional, autonomous religious life, disconnected from the court's authority. Every time that traffic became uneven, favoring some shrines and neglecting others based on which clan currently held favor at court, rather than on any principle a local community could recognize as fair, it created exactly the kind of friction the Kogo Shūi complains about. A local community watching its relationship to the center fray, not through any dramatic rupture, but through the same slow, cumulative neglect that had already hollowed out the Inbe clan's own standing at the center itself. The community-level tension and the clan-level tension are, in this sense, the same structural problem appearing at two different scales, and the Kogo Shūi's complaint about neglected shrines is best understood as a single, traceable instance of a problem that was, in principle, replicated wherever the center's attention happened to drift. This is a crucial distinction, and it's worth being precise about it. An individual Inbe priest, however skilled or devout, could not simply outperform his way into Nakatomi-level influence through personal merit, because the unit that held standing in this system was the hereditary house, not the person. What moved a family up or down the informal hierarchy was the family's collective political position, its marriages, its patrons, its accumulated favor or disfavor at court, not the individual talents of any single member. This is why Hironari's response to his clan's declining status could not simply be work harder or perform better. There was no individual achievement available to him that would address a problem operating at the level of clan standing. The only lever available to him was exactly the one he pulled: an appeal to the deep collective memory and divine pedigree of the clan as a whole, an attempt to elevate the entire house's position by reasserting its ancestral dignity rather than by accumulating personal credit. Beneath the political and ritual structure sat the economic structure that made all of this matter in such concrete terms. Ritual status was not merely symbolic. It converted directly into material resources, land grants, court stipends, and crucially, the flow of imperial offerings that were directed toward shrines and ritual specialists associated with favored clans. This is the detail that turns an abstract dispute over ceremonial precedent into something with real teeth. When the text describes shrines connected to the Nakatomi receiving preferential treatment in the distribution of imperial offerings, regardless of the actual religious merit or historical seniority of rival shrines. It is describing an economic mechanism, not merely a ceremonial one. Whoever controlled the channels through which those offerings flowed controlled a meaningful stream of wealth and resource allocation across the whole network of court-affiliated shrines. Losing ritual prestige did not just mean losing prestige in some abstract reputational sense. It meant watching a tangible economic advantage drift toward a rival house, year after year, offering after offering, until the gap between the two clans' material positions had widened into something that mirrored and reinforced the gap in their political standing. It's worth zooming out from the court itself for a moment, because the tension the Kogo Shūi describes was not confined to the upper echelons of imperial ceremony. It echoed a broader structural tension that ran through the religious landscape of the period as a whole. The relationship between the centralized ritual apparatus of the court and the vast, decentralized world of local shrines and kami cults scattered across the countryside. The imperial ritual system depended, for its legitimacy, on being understood as the central node of a religious network that extended outward into every region, every local shrine, every community's relationship with its own particular kami. But the actual texture of local religious practice was far more autonomous, far more rooted in regional tradition, than any centralized system could fully absorb or control. The complaints embedded in the Kogo Shūi about neglected precedent and unequal treatment of shrines are, in a sense, a localized version of this much larger and more persistent friction between center and periphery. A friction that runs through the entire history of attempts to unify Japan's religious landscape under a single imperial framework. The Inbe clan, in this light, can be read as occupying an uncomfortable position between these two worlds. Hereditary court officials with a centralized role, but representing a tradition whose roots and authority were always at least partly anchored outside the capital, in the older, more dispersed world of regional kami worship that the centralized system never fully managed to absorb. It's worth pushing further into the actual administrative texture of the Jingi-kan itself, because the department's internal logic reproduces, in miniature, every tension we've already traced at the level of the court as a whole. The department was not a single undifferentiated bureaucracy, issuing uniform decisions. It was a layered structure of hereditary specialists, each clan holding what amounted to a property right in a particular function. And property rights of this kind are notoriously difficult to adjust once political conditions shift underneath them. You cannot simply reassign the Inbe clan's traditional role in handling the sacred regalia to some more politically convenient house, not without provoking exactly the kind of formal challenge a document like the Kogo Shūi represents. What you can do, far more quietly and with far less risk of provoking that challenge, is leave the formal allocation of duties untouched while steadily redirecting the informal flow of resources, attention, and prestige that surrounds those duties. This is precisely the mechanism by which the Nakatomi's rise translated into Inbe decline, without any single administrative act ever needing to revoke the Inbe clan's nominal privileges. The structure stayed the same on paper. Its actual operation hollowed out from the inside, and hollowing out from the inside is a far harder thing to formally protest than an outright revocation would have been, precisely because there is no single decision anyone can point to as the moment the wrong occurred. This dynamic helps explain why rank mattered so disproportionately in this system, beyond its obvious function as a marker of prestige. Court rank in Heian Japan operated as a kind of universal currency, that could be checked against any number of other claims: income entitlements, ceremonial precedence, eligibility for specific offices. And because it was universal in this way, it became the place where contested status most often surfaced as a formal dispute. This is exactly why later chroniclers found themselves disagreeing about whether Hironari held the sub-junior 5th rank or the higher senior 6th at the moment he submitted his text. One account ties the date of submission to the higher rank. Another, drawing on what's described as one of the more authoritative national histories of the following century, places him at the lower rank shortly before, suggesting a later editor adjusted the date specifically to make it consistent with the more flattering rank. Notice what this tells us about the system as a whole. Even a full century after the Kogo Shūi was written, the precise calibration of one petitioner's status was still important enough, still contested enough, that someone felt compelled to massage the record to make the numbers align favorably. Rank was never settled once and recorded. It was perpetually being renegotiated, in both directions, by people with a stake in how the historical record would eventually read. A system that produces this kind of retrospective tampering around a single individual's rank is a system in which formal status was always, at some level, a live political question rather than a fixed administrative fact. And that instability at the level of individual rank is the same instability driving the larger conflict between the two clans. It's also worth tracing how this status competition extended outward from the court itself into the network of shrines spread across the country, because the imperial offerings mentioned earlier were not abstractions. They followed specific, traceable channels, and those channels ran through specific shrines tied to specific clans. A shrine standing in this system was not simply a matter of its antiquity or its local reputation among ordinary worshippers. It was a matter of its formal relationship to the court's ritual apparatus, and that relationship could shift, sometimes quite suddenly, as the balance of power between the clans overseeing different aspects of court religion shifted along with it. This produces a secondary layer of conflict beneath the headline Inbe Nakatomi rivalry. A whole landscape of regional shrines, each watching its own access to imperial recognition and imperial offerings rise or fall, depending on which clan currently held the upper hand at the center. The text's complaint that certain shrines suffered neglect regardless of their actual historical seniority is not a minor administrative footnote. It is the local, geographically distributed expression of the exact same structural problem playing out at court, formal status and actual treatment drifting apart, with the gap between them tracking political fortune rather than any principle that could be defended on its own terms. The direct economic stakes embedded in ritual status and traceable through specific shrines and specific offerings, and the deeper tension between centralized court religion and the older decentralized world of local kami worship, is a social structure that did not need a single dramatic event to produce conflict. It produced conflict simply by existing and continuing to operate over multiple generations, because every one of these layers contained the same basic instability: formal equality sitting on top of informal and growing inequality, with no mechanism built into the system capable of correcting that drift once it began. The Kogo Shūi is not an isolated outburst. Not a sword, not a lawsuit in any modern sense, but a rewritten myth, submitted in the most respectful possible language, to the one authority still capable of being moved by an appeal to the sacred order of things. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.